Greetings, YouTubers. This video will be kind of an addendum or a follow-up to a video I've already done on federal debt per capita. This will be federal spending per capita and a few other items. I need to mention this. I use Christopher Chantrell's website again. I have all the links below where you can look up all the population data that I use. I had several sources for population data. And all the data for my federal spending. We're even going to go over net interest payments too. But one thing I noticed after you get in the 1940s, well, from 1940 on, OMB has got data to where it adjusts federal spending to inflation for 2009 dollars. And I noticed that Christopher Chantrell's website was kind of lowballing the federal spending. So I went with what OMB has, and so if you want to, you can just discard everything before 1945. I mean, you should get a rough estimate. You'll get the general idea. But the figures 1945 and later are a lot more accurate. So, but his website still, I do recommend using his website. It's very, he's got tons of information there. I mean, gobs of information. So without further ado, let's just go over federal spending per capita. Again, in 1945 on, it's a lot more accurate. But you can see the Civil War, and this happened, it happened in the American Spanish-American War, Civil War, World War I, World War II. I mean, every time the U.S. has a major military buildup, it even happened in the War of 1812, federal spending spikes. But what happened prior to World War I, it would get really close to its pre-spike level. After World War I, that did not happen. As this is even before LBJ's welfare state, even before Social Security, even before the Federal Reserve. Well, 1913, I guess it would have been in its infancy, but you can see the pre-war level, it never got close to it, especially after World War I, even before we had all these social programs. Now, I could understand federal spending going up somewhat, with the construction of highways and the postal system and more advanced weaponry for the Department of Defense, but not necessarily because, if you look at the prices of electronics over the past several decades, they've gotten a lot better and cheaper, so that's not necessarily a given. But for what it's worth, here's federal spending per capita. You can see, as of today, we are spending a lot more than we were even at the height of World War I spending. And you can see Eisenhower, Coolidge did this too. Under Coolidge, taxes were cut across the board. And spending was drastically cut as well. And the national debt severely declined. Coolidge was the last president, he and his Republican Congress, to do that. Eisenhower also had success with that under a Democrat Congress, as you can see. But look at the pre-World War I level, not even close. And like I said, Chantrell seemed like he was lowballing it a little bit, so it might be higher than, actually a little higher than 799. Even with insanely high tax rates in the 60s and 70s. And prior to, well, the welfare state really, it wasn't going for that entire period, 61 to 81. But you can see federal spending per capita almost doubling in that time. Short of doubling, but a healthy increase from 61 to 81. Spending per capita, adjusted for inflation. Under Reagan, well, you can see it increased almost $1,000, a pretty healthy increase. From the end of Reagan, fiscal year 1989 was his last one, to the end of George Herbert Walker Bush, you can see it went up almost $200. Bill Clinton and his Republican Congress did a good job controlling spending. As you can see, barely a little over $100 increase, almost $140 increase per capita, federal spending per capita in his during his tenure in the presidency. And you can see, as soon as George W. Bush gets in, and I'm not saying before Bush the government pinched pennies, because it did not. There's tons of ways. But George W. Bush and LBJ and Obama stand out as the big spenders. And you can see whether the economy was good or bad. There was 1 year, 2007, where Bush's spending, federal spending adjusted for inflation per capita, went down. But you can see overall, it didn't matter whether the economy was good, whether the housing boom was at its height, the artificial housing boom, or the economy was collapsing. George W. Bush and his Congress were big spenders. And Obama's just continued that. Now, there will be some progressives that point out that Obama's cutting spending. But that's like saying, I hand George W. Bush my credit card, and it's got a $1,000 balance. This is just an example. And when he hands it back to me, it's got a $10,000 balance. And then I hand it to Obama. He gets it down to $9,500. Obama's only a penny pincher if you use fiscal year 2009, which was Bush's last, as your baseline. So it really doesn't work. You compare Obama to Clinton or Reagan, not even close. And I'll get into a little something about federal payments on interest just very shortly. So as you can see, federal spending, especially since George W. Bush took office, has exploded. There's no debating that George Bush wasn't a big spender. Nobody's denying that. And if they are, they're crazy. And it's going to get more and more tough. Going back, another point I should make. From 61 to 81, almost $3,100 per spending per capita was added from 61 to 81. Yet Medicare and Social Security, although Social Security got in big trouble in the 70s, and we've plugged that hole with so many tax hikes, but Medicare wasn't running off the rails, and Social Security, the baby boomers were still working back then. In fact, most of them were in the workforce, or just getting in. So you can see how even back then, and with those stratospheric tax rates, they continued to spend more and more. Next little piece of business we're going to go over. I hope I explained that well enough for all of you. If you have any questions, please ask. Look at inflation-adjusted net interest outlays. Now, this is something, I've mentioned this before. I've gone over this before. Bush and Obama lucked out because they're with much lower interest rates. Otherwise, their spending binges, their deficits would look even larger. But from 62 to 81, the average per year adjusted for inflation was $69.5 billion. And it does include the fiscal year end when it was changed and after the 76 fiscal year. Congress needed 3 more months to not get a budget out, as they do most of the time, so they changed the fiscal year from the end of June to the end of September. During Reagan, from 1982, fiscal years 82 to 89, first 6 years a Republican Senate, last 2 years was a Democrat Congress entirely, $217.58 billion per fiscal year, and you'll see that's a lot. That was a good chunk of all federal spending. Clinton even got hit with this too. Even harder. 1990 to 1993, George Herbert Walker Bush, it was over $280 billion per fiscal year. Fiscal year 1994 through 2001, $291 billion per fiscal year. That was Clinton. George W. Bush, $211.125 billion per fiscal year. So you can see, adjusted for inflation, his payments were, he was saving over $6 billion from what it was under Reagan, and about $80 billion from what it was under Clinton, adjusted for inflation. It was a much smaller portion of all federal outlays. And Hussein Obama, it's even lower, $209.175 billion. So he's about almost $8 billion less than what Reagan. Now, if we look at net interest outlays as a percentage of all federal spending, you can see from 62 to 81, not much of change. Although under Jimmy Carter, and I've got all the links under, you can go look at this yourself, just to check me out, make sure I'm telling you the truth. It was in Carter's administration, when this really started to get out of control. But from 62 to 81, the overall average net interest outlays as a percentage of all federal spending, and this is adjusted for inflation, 6.386%. Under Reagan, it was 12.405%, Reagan and his Congress. George Herbert Walker Bush and his Congress, 13.807%. So you can see it's spiked. And under Clinton, it was very high as well, 13.56%. From fiscal year 2002 through 2009 under George W. Bush, 7.582%, and Hussein's is even lower, 6.192%. So Hussein's net interest outlays as a percentage of all federal spending, under Reagan, it was more than double that. So there you go. One more quick thing. I've mentioned this before, the three main things that are going to break the United States is entitlement spending in the welfare state, specifically Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security spending, and specifically since Obamacare was passed, Medicaid spending was growing rapidly even before then. Now it's on steroids, if you can believe that. So it's these three programs, along with defense spending, that we have to get under control. And if we don't do that, net interest payments on our debt are going to become a huge problem, because it's about the end of Hussein's presidency. It's going to start probably upticking again. Those three things will break us. Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security spending. This is average. I didn't do a percentage of what it was. What percentage of percentage of the federal budget. I need to make a point on that real quick. So net interest payments or whatever could be going down as a percentage of the budget, but actually increasing. It's just that they're growing the rest of the budget even faster. So you got to look at those with caution. Adjusted for inflation from fiscal year 1962 through 1981. That would have been Jimmy Carter's last fiscal year, 1981. Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security spending was only just short of $213 billion a fiscal year. Under Reagan and his Congress, it upticked to almost $500 billion. We're looking at $487.725 billion. So added quite a bit. You can see it's just growing exponentially. It's out of control. Under George Herbert Walker Bush, it was over $628 billion a fiscal year. Under Billy Boy Clinton and his Congress, his Republican Congress, $814.812 billion a fiscal year. And it was under George W. Bush that the first time it cost over $1 trillion in fiscal year 2003, and the average for his entire presidency under him and his Congress, $1,116,975,000,000 a fiscal year. Over $1.1 trillion average per fiscal year. This is adjusted for inflation too, folks. So you can see it is just growing massively. Under Hussein, it's over $1.4 trillion a fiscal year, well over. So you can see those programs, and I've got all my links underneath there. These programs are out of control. So hopefully you found that interesting. You can see it's becoming harder and harder for each president as we get further to more of the boomers retiring to balance the budget because they have Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. We continue to have presidents who think we need to play the world policeman, play that role. It's getting much tougher to balance the budget. There's going to have to be a lot of cutting done. We need to find somebody who's willing to do that, or America can just keep electing idiots. So hopefully you found that interesting. Answered a few progressive pushbacks. I will be referring to this video in later videos as well. But you can see anybody who says the Washington is not spending enough on entitlements in the welfare state. Medicare is a means-tested program. It's not considered an entitlement. Social Security and Medicare are. Medicaid is one of the bigger means-tested programs. But we're in serious trouble, folks. Again, look at those figures pertaining to federal spending per capita adjusted for inflation. It is out of control. The last presidency, we saw that decline by a significant amount. It was Eisenhower and Calvin Coolidge would have been the two guys. Since then, not really. Even under Clinton, it still increased slightly. So have a nice day, and you've been warned.